Quit monkeying around with that thing. Greetings, mateys. It's me, Captain Adam, and welcome aboard me VHS pirate ship.
It's the VHS pirate ship.
And today, we're gonna... Hold on. Hello? Yes, this is Captain Adam. Yes. You want me to do a show about ape movies? Ape Tapes? Okay. Okay, I can do that. Okay, bye-bye. Well, we're doing a show about ape movies. So join the fun, and let's go ape shit. It's the adventures in Ape Tapes. Yarr!
The apes, a classification of simian, which is a species of greater primates. The ape kingdom's more famous species are gorillas, orangutans, and chimpanzees. They are smart, majestic creatures that naturally look great on film. And the movie industry didn't shy away from that fact, as the ape film became its own genre. From King Kong to Dunstan Checks In, the ape movie is still a popular genre of film today. And if we're talking about ape movies, you gotta start with the granddaddy of them all, King Kong. King Kong was released in theaters in 1933, and it would completely revolutionize how films were made. As it's not only the granddaddy of all ape movies, it's also the granddaddy of all movie special effects. With its use of stop-motion animation, it would leave the world with a sense of awe. And this was in 1933. Just imagine how big that must have been. At this time, we weren't too far out of the silent movie era, as movies had recently just gotten sound, and here you are watching a giant gorilla fight a T-Rex. It must have been amazing to see that for the first time, which is why King Kong is one of the world's most important films. As I had mentioned, it was originally released in 1933, but then go on to be re-released multiple times. It would be re-released in 1938, 1942, 1946, 1952, and 1956, and then go on to be released on VHS multiple times as well. And it's actually pretty difficult to pin down release dates on most of this stuff, but the most famous was the 1993 Turner Home Entertainment release, which celebrated the film's 60th anniversary. It actually featured a button on the box that when you press it, it roared, and it was one of the first films to be released on Laserdisc in 1984. Given that the film was so popular, they didn't even wait a whole year to release a sequel with Son of Kong, which was released in December of 1933. And that film is about, you guessed it, the son of King Kong. And he's a smaller and friendlier version of King Kong. In fact, the film is actually pretty goofy and doesn't really seem like a sequel. Son of Kong would later be released on VHS in the 1980s by Nostalgia Merchant. And when I first read the script for today's show, I misread that, and I thought it said it was released on VHS by Natalie Merchant. And I was very confused. But no, it's Nostalgia Merchant. And it would be released on VHS again in 1991 by Turner Home Entertainment. And Nostalgia Merchant did their own distribution of King Kong in 1978. And in the 1960s, Japan did their own version of Kong movies with the Toho-produced King Kong vs. Godzilla in 1962. And in those movies, the Toho version of King Kong was much larger than he was in the American version. And in 1967, they would go on to produce King Kong Escapes, wherein King Kong fights a giant mechanical version of himself called Mechani Kong.
Mechani Kong.
Not to be confused with Macaulay Kong. And this film is based on the King Kong Show, which was co-produced by Rankin and Bass. That aired on television from 1966 to 1969. King Kong vs. Godzilla was released on VHS in the 80s by Good Times Home Video, and then was released on VHS again in 1998 as part of its 35th anniversary, and it was released in a clamshell. A damn clamshell! And you can find these VHS pretty easily today, with the price ranging from $15 all the way down to $1. Now here's where things get sort of interesting. The other Toho Kong film, King Kong Escapes, was never released on VHS over here in the States, but it was released on VHS in Japan. And you can find this today, but it's going to cost you. So all of this has just been the tip of the iceberg. So let's go farther down the King Kong rabbit hole and explore ape movies a little further, because in today's episode, we're going ape shit. It's Adventures in Ape Tapes. Okay, so King Kong is such an important film that it's actually a household name now. You don't need to see the movie to know who he is. King Kong is still very present today. With Peter Jackson's remake in 2005 and Kong Skull Island, King Kong is still a very popular movie genre. And let's go back to 1976 for the modern day remake of King Kong. And it's the same King Kong story, just set in 1976. And if you've ever asked yourself, what would King Kong be like in the 70s, then this movie is for you. It was released in theaters December 17th, 1976, and starred Jeff Bridges. And this would have a few different distributions on VHS through the 1980s. And you can find them today for around $12. Now, I don't typically talk about DVD releases on this show, but there is an interesting factoid associated with this DVD release. See, the original DVD release had the original movie poster, which featured King Kong standing astride the Twin Towers. And given the terrorist attacks on September 11th, 2001, Paramount Home Video voluntarily recalled all copies of this DVD and then later reissued the DVD with a different cover. Good form and a tasteful move. And the 1976 remake would have its own sequel with King Kong Lives, which was released in theaters December 19th, 1986, and starred Linda Hamilton. Yep, Sarah Connor was in a King Kong film. I had no idea. My CPU does not encompass the dynamics of human movie casting. I do not have detailed files on King Kong Lives. Don't worry, not too many people do. So anyway, yeah, in this movie, King Kong actually survives his fall from the World Trade Center, because in the 1976 remake, Kong climbs the World Trade Center as opposed to the Empire State Building like in the original. So anyways, he survives the fall, and he's in a coma, and they're trying to save him because they want to save the species. And they actually make him a giant artificial heart, but he's lost so much blood that he needs a blood transfusion. So they set out seeking another Kong to help with this problem. Because hey, big ape, big blood, and if you got a big ape that needs big blood, you need to find another big ape for that big blood. And they do find it with a female Kong that ends up being King Kong's love interest. And I know that sounds silly, but I am just summing things up here. There's a lot that happens in this film. And though this was eaten alive by critics, it's not a bad watch for what it is, and it's definitely not what you'd expect. It was released on VHS in 1987 and had a small slew of VHS releases through the 90s, including one from good old Video Treasures. And actually, all the VHS releases of this movie are pretty pricey. I mean, look at this one. It's just the tape, no case, going for $8. I know, right? How do you lose a tape case? I don't understand. What happened to it? I know. Okay, just settle down. Settle down. Everybody calm down. Calm down, guys. Calm down. Everybody calm down. Everybody. Okay, we're back. Anyways, King Kong Lives is interesting because when it was released overseas, it was released as King Kong 2. Electric Boogaloo. Nah, it was just King Kong 2. And then later on down the road in 1998, there was an animated kids movie called The Mighty Kong and featured Dudley Moore as one of the voiceovers. I mean, this is a kids movie, but if you're a Kong collector, then I'm sure you probably want to have this. And the VHS, of course, is in a kid's clamshell, and you can get it today for around $5 to $10. And all these things just go to show you that King Kong is a very important genre of film. Movies, cartoons, toys, and even if you've never seen any of the movies, when somebody says King Kong, you know what they're talking about. Kong took the world by storm, and though it is often said that imitation is the most sincerest form of flattery, sometimes, however, it's just a way to capitalize on something popular and make a quick buck. So let's explore some Kong ripoffs after this. Captain Adam's VHS pirate ship will return after this. Hey there, folks, it's me, Little Vino. And did you fuck your car up somehow? Maybe the engine's running rough because you haven't changed the oil in 3 goddamn years. Or maybe it's overheating because heaven forbid you check your antifreeze. Or maybe you need a new tire because you hit a curb because you were texting while you were driving. Like a fucking moron. Either way, your vehicle's fucked up, and I'm sure it's your fault. But I ain't here to judge. I'm just here to fix your car and take your money and serve you a nice cheesesteak while you wait. So come on down to Little Vino's Auto Repair and Cheesesteak Emporium. We do all sorts of automotive repair and got lots of cheesesteaks. And for a limited time only, we'll give you an oil change and refill your blinker fluid. Because a lot of you morons must be out of blinker fluid because you don't use your blinkers.
Use your fucking blinkers.
So come on down to Little Vino's Automotive Repair and Cheesesteak Emporium. Just because you're a fucking moron doesn't mean your taste buds are. Little Vino's Automotive Repair
and Cheesesteak Emporium.
Injured at work, rough divorce, was a loved one killed in a horrible circus accident? The law offices of Dillon and Triceratops. They'll fight for you. Call today. If it is Buccal, it is good. This is Buccal Products. Buccal Products makes long line of good things. We make the walkie-talkie toaster, which is a toaster that is also a walkie-talkie. We also make internal combustion engine that is also potato salad. And now we make new chicken-flavored adhesive tape at always low price. We are Buccal Products. If it is Buccal, it is good.
Buccal Products.
We now return you to Captain Adam's VHS pirate ship. Okay, so when you make a film about a giant ape, chances are people are going to love it. And the success of 1933's King Kong is proof of that. And so other studios are going to want to muscle in on the business and making their own giant ape films in the hope that it will be just as popular. So let's start off with our first Kong imitator with Mighty Joe Young. The story centers around Jill Young, who lives in Africa with her father, and her pet gorilla, Joe. But Joe is special because he's way bigger than any other gorilla. So everything's fine and they're having a good old time in Africa when these two dickheads show up. And they're looking for wild animals to feature in a new nightclub act. And then they discover Joe and eventually convince Jill to take them both back to the States. And that's when the shenanigans start. At first the act is successful, but eventually Joe starts feeling homesick and tormented and degraded, and eventually somebody gets him drunk and he goes on a rampage, but then he sees an orphanage that's on fire and saves all the kids inside, making him a hero. Mighty Joe Young was released in theaters July 27th, 1949. And it would be released on VHS numerous times through the 80s and early 90s. And Turner Home Entertainment would eventually acquire the rights and release a VHS in the 90s. Man, did they own everything? Jeez. As far as VHS collecting goes, I think it would be pretty fun to try to collect all the different distributions this film had. And you can find them for around $10, so it's pretty reasonable, except for this shit. $1,000. Right. Okay, so maybe it's a little unfair to call Mighty Joe Young a King Kong imitation. I mean, the story's quite different, and Joe wasn't as big as Kong was, size-wise, and the same creative team that worked on King Kong also worked on Mighty Joe Young. And plus, it's not like Mighty Joe Young wasn't popular. I mean, if you've heard of King Kong, you've probably also heard of Mighty Joe Young. The movie was a hit when it came out, and Disney even made a remake in 1998. And you can find that on VHS today for around $10. Also, there's a blues artist named Mighty Joe Young, and the band Stone Temple Pilots were originally called Mighty Joe Young. So really, all in all, Mighty Joe Young isn't a King Kong imitator. But this next movie sure as hell is, with Congo. I mean, shit, they didn't even bother changing the name very much. Just take Kong and put an A at the end. People won't know the difference. And yeah, that's pretty much how that came about. It was released in theaters in January of 1961, and it's about a botanist, Dr. Charles Decker, who finds a way to grow plants to enormous sizes. And he decides to test this on a chimpanzee. And not only does it work, it somehow turns the chimpanzee into a murderous gorilla. Not really sure how, but whatever. And then later, the chimp turned murderous gorilla grows even bigger and goes on a rampage. This film is batshit crazy. There's murder and carnivorous plants, but it certainly wasn't breaking any boundaries when it came to special effects. I mean, look at that. For fuck's sakes. But it is what it is, and this would later go on to be released on VHS. And it's actually pretty hard to find, because there's really only the one distribution that I know of, so it would be a neat addition to your VHS collection. But let's go on to a total King Kong ripoff with the movie Ape. And this movie features a giant gorilla who fights a giant shark, and then fights a giant python, and then goes on all sorts of rampages. What's interesting about this film is all the name changes it has. See, it was originally released as Super Kong, and being that it was released at exactly the same time as the 1976 King Kong remake, there was a lawsuit involved, and they had to legally change the name of the film. They would then change it to Super Ape, and then eventually just Ape. And then in 1982, it was re-released as a Grindhouse feature as The Attack of the Giant Horny Gorilla. Just kind of like me on Friday nights, you know what I'm saying? And it was released in Korea as King Kong's Great Counterattack, which is a little bit wordy, but maybe it's a translation thing. And this movie also stars the mom from Growing Pains, so there's that. This movie would eventually get a VHS release, which is actually really hard to find nowadays, and it's pretty pricey. But what a great piece for your VHS collection. But let's move on to an entire saga of ape movies that revolutionized science fiction as we know it. So let's talk about sci-fi movie sagas for a second. So you got your Star Trek movies, you got your Star Wars movies, but before those, there was the Planet of the Apes saga. And a lot of people tend to forget that there was actually 5 films in the saga. Everyone knows about the first movie, Planet of the Apes, but some people are surprised that there was a sequel, let alone 4 of them. But there sure was, with Beneath the Planet of the Apes, Escape from Planet of the Apes, Conquest of Planet of the Apes, and Battle for Planet of the Apes. Now, these sequels weren't nearly as successful as the original, which was a powerhouse. And the original Planet of the Apes was released in theaters March 27th, 1968. And the story centers around some astronauts that crash land on what they think is an alien planet. And this planet is ruled by highly evolved apes, and humans are on the animal level. And of course, it's later found out that this is actually planet Earth, but way into the future. Sorry to spoil it for you, but you probably should have seen this movie by now. And I say this is a revolutionary science fiction film mainly because it's completely different than any other science fiction movie. See, it doesn't take place in space or on an alien planet. It takes place on a future Earth where apes have evolved to high levels. So in the sci-fi world, this is a very unique story. Not to mention, at the time, it did have some pretty groundbreaking makeup effects. This movie was huge when it came out, and it still holds true today, as there's since been not 1 but 2 remakes, and there was even a 1975 cartoon show called Return to Planet of the Apes. And there were action figures for this. I mean, Planet of the Apes was a pretty big deal. The whole saga would be released on VHS through the 80s and again through the 90s, which the most famous was the mid-90s box set release, where all the movies were remastered and had THX sound. And before that, they were released in 1990 in these really unattractive sleeves. Is it just me, or do these just look a little tacky? And then before that, they were released in 1985 by Playhouse Home Video. And these aren't very expensive. You can find any of these distributions today from around $7 to $15. Planet of the Apes is a pretty important franchise, not just to science fiction movies, but also to ape movies, because it sure as hell wasn't Congo. But here's a little tidbit about Congo. The actor who played Dr. Charles Decker was Michael Gough, the same actor who portrayed Alfred in the 1989 Batman film, which is, of course, the greatest Batman film. Yeah, I know Heath Ledger was a great Joker, but would you really watch The Dark Knight if he wasn't in it? Really think about that. You might see it once, and that's about it. You certainly wouldn't say it's the greatest Batman film, because the truth is, The Dark Knight was not a great Batman film, but Heath Ledger was a great Joker.
Wait a minute. I thought this show was about ape movies.
You're right. I'm sorry. Let's get back on track. But all the movies I've talked about so far today did not feature a real ape. So let's talk about a film that does feature an ape as one of the actors, with Every Which Way But Loose. And this movie paired Clint Eastwood with an orangutan named Clyde. And in the movie, Clint Eastwood portrays Philo Beto, a prize fighter with his pet orangutan. And the movie is a classic late 70s bare-knuckle brawl, trucking, all kinds of stuff happens kind of movie, but there just happens to be an orangutan. It's a pretty fun movie. I mean, there's a motorcycle gang, there's all kinds of fights. It's great. And don't get me wrong, I love this movie, but would it really stand out without the orangutan? Probably not. It was released in theaters December 20th, 1978, and the sequel, Any Which Way You Can, was released in theaters December 17th, 1980. Man, what a great poster. I'm telling you, late 70s, early 80s movies had the greatest artwork on their posters. Much like the Atari 2600 games, they had great cover art.
It's happening again. You're getting off track. We're talking about ape movies.
He's right. I'm sorry. Anyways, both movies were released on VHS in the early 80s in the good old Warner Brothers home video clamshell. Then they would be released again in 1991, and then again through 1995 to 1997 as part of the Warner Brothers Hits collection. These movies are great, and don't get me wrong, Clint Eastwood is great too. But the orangutan really makes this movie, much like Heath Ledger made The Dark Knight. And by the way, the orangutan's real name is Manus. And though he was in Every Which Way But Loose, a different orangutan portrayed Clyde in Any Which Way You Can, because Manus had grown too old to play the role. But Manus would go on to be in Cannonball Run too. But using a real ape in the cast is not a new concept. For example, the 1970 television show Lancelot Link, Secret Chimp, was a show about spies where everyone was played by a chimpanzee. That's right, the entire cast was nothing but chimpanzees. Then you had the 1979 television show BJ and the Bear, which was about a truck driver and his chimpanzee buddy. But now I think it's time for a little controversy.
Controversy time, yeah.
Okay, so let me lay this on you. Whether or not Bigfoot is real, and whether or not you believe he is real, all the science points to the fact that a Sasquatch would be a primate and would be classified as a species of great apes. And therefore, that makes Harry and the Hendersons an ape movie. Oh, lighten up. We spent the entire episode talking about giant apes, and now you have a problem? Gee whiz. Harry and the Hendersons was released in theaters June 5th, 1987, and it's a comedy about a family that discovers Bigfoot, and eventually Bigfoot ends up living with them, and they name the Bigfoot Harry. And the guy who plays Harry is the same guy who played the Predator, and this would go on to be released on VHS later on in 1987, and then again in 1992, and then in 1998 it was re-released in a kid's clamshell. Great. And not all ape movies are either horror, sci-fi, or comedies. There was 1988's Gorillas in the Mist, which I'm sure has its merits, but it's just not as fun to talk about dramas. So let's talk about Congo. Congo was released in theaters June 9th, 1995, and it's about specially bred murderous gray gorillas that guard a mine, and about an expedition group that gets into trouble hand over fist. This movie is bananas. Oh, I'm sorry, come on, I'm sorry. This movie is based on the Michael Crichton novel, the same author as Jurassic Park, as if you didn't know that, and this movie was promoted as such, but people that went to go see this movie expecting another Jurassic Park were woefully disappointed, as this movie was torn apart by critics and moviegoers alike. It was released on VHS later on in 1995, and you can find one today for $5. There was all kinds of merchandise for this film, but nobody gave a shit. So let's go back to 1940 with the release of The Ape, a classic horror film starring Boris Karloff. Though it's not really about an ape, it's about Boris Karloff's character wearing an ape carcass and killing people while wearing it in order to collect their spinal fluid. It's a long story. Most people forget about this movie, but it still makes a great addition to your VHS collection. I'm sorry everyone, but I'm just not going to talk about Dunstan Checks In. But it was released in 1995 and does feature a real orangutan. And if you want the VHS, you can find one today for $2. Why would you sell it for that? That doesn't even cover the cost of the packaging to ship it in. You're in the red before you even get to the post office. Oh well. And there was a Laserdisc of this movie, so if you're a Laserdisc collector, you might want to add this to your roster. So anyways, in closing, ape movies are a very important part of the cinematic landscape, and they shall always be a part of history. And there shall always be remakes. And speaking of that, I know I just briefly covered the 1998 remake of Mighty Joe Young, but that is actually a pretty good movie, and the effects are very well done. And then when it comes to the 1976 King Kong remake, they chose to go with a guy in a gorilla suit as opposed to stop-motion animation. And what that movie is most notable for is that it features a smoking hot Jessica Lange. Go figure. Ape movies will always be important, and whether the movie is good or bad, and whether or not the ape in it is friend or foe, mate or menace, the ape movie will always be a sight to see. So thanks a lot for watching, and thanks a lot for going ape shit with me today, and I'll see you next time on Captain Adam's VHS Pirate Ship.